But I'd like to go through, talk about night flying, because night flying is one of those things that you never know when you might actually want to do that. And so we'd like to keep everyone prepared. So to finish up this morning's session on advanced flying techniques, we'll talk about night flying. So we'll talk some general information about how you get a night flying waiver and some of the quick legalities to that. Talk about some of the challenges that you might face as you're starting to learn how to fly drones at night. Talk about some of the essential equipment, how to do some updated operational planning, and some other pre-flight things that you might need to take care of as well. And then finally, we'll finish off with discussing some of the more challenging visual illusions that you might face as you fly drones at night. Okay, so some general information about flying at night. So what is night? Obviously is the first question that comes to mind. We might think of night as whenever it gets dark, but it does have a legal definition. Right, so our rough definition of light here is that the nighttime waiver, you'll need it if you want to fly 30 minutes after sunset or 30 minutes before sunrise. So civil twilight is that 30-minute time span between sunset and what is considered night. And we have another shoulder of civil twilight, 30 minutes prior to sunrise. Now, flying at night can be a little bit tricky. Right? We're flying at night. We don't have a lot of the visual aids that we come to rely on when we fly at night. And there was a lot more challenging visual illusions to overcome. So what do we need to fly at night? So first, you need to get a Part 107.29 waiver from the FAA. You'll also need anti-collision lights. Make sure that you have sufficient lighting on your drone. And you'll need to have some sort of additional night flying training. So if you're within the UC system and you want to fly at night, this training session will count for the necessary training requirement for utilizing our night flying waiver. Now, our night flying waiver is not particularly hard to get. It does take a little bit of time and effort to put into it. You must demonstrate that you or your organization is prepared for night flying. You must be able to demonstrate, or at least say that you can demonstrate, a process for adjusting to night flying risks and a process for training or making sure that everyone is up to date on how to handle night flying activities. Now, our night flying waiver is only valid in Class G airspace. So if you want to use your night flying waiver in other controlled airspace, you need to file a separate airspace authorization through DroneZone. You cannot use your night flying waiver with Lance for any night flying you want to do with in a controlled airspace. You do need to go through the DroneZone and get a wide area authorization. Now, currently, our night flying waivers are valid for 4 years. I am crossing my fingers, though, that the FAA does change that. They are proposing to change to make night flying a basic Part 107 activity rather than a waivered activity. It will likely require this additional training, but I do hope that this waiver process for night flying will eventually be phased out. So, what are some of the challenges to flying at night? The first big challenge about flying at night is we must maintain visual line of sight with the drone at all times. The line of sight rules and regulations still apply. In fact, all other 107 regulations will still apply at night, except for that one regulation, 107.29, that is going to be waived. So all those same challenges of visual line of sight during the day will still apply at night, but it's going to be even harder. So remember that our eyes still take about 30 to 45 minutes to fully adapt to the dark. You'll always need to maintain our visual line of sight, so we need to make sure that our eyes are ready to actually see our drone from all these distances. Now, in many cases, in fact, most waivers that I've seen, you are required to have at least one visual observer for night flying activity. Obviously, the more visual observers, the more helpers you have, the better and safer you're likely to be, but you'll always need at least one. Now, with visual line of sight, remember, our visual line of sight requires us to understand the altitude, attitude, and orientation of our drone at all times. So if all we can see of our drone is just the blinking strobe light on our drone, that's not sufficient for visual line of sight because we cannot tell orientation or aircraft attitude. So we need to make sure that we have additional means to identify our drone and all the other parameters for visual line of sight. So all of our other 107 regulations are still valid. We still may not fly above 400 feet. We still may not fly faster than 100 miles an hour, and all that other fun stuff associated with Part 107. Next major challenge about flying at night, we need to really make sure that our crew is ready for this. So crew resource management, again, is a very important aspect to flying at night. We talked about the importance of a visual observer on Tuesday. Night flying, it becomes even more critical. Communication protocols become even more important because our visual sight is diminished, and we must be able to communicate what information that we have so that we can share it with the group. And it becomes even more difficult, right? If we're looking for intruding air traffic or ground hazards, it becomes a lot harder to do at night, and so we may need more visual observers than we might normally utilize. Now we have to think about, well, how do we have, or what communication protocols might we have in place? We don't want 4 or 5 people all yelling different information, because then we just don't know what's happening, right? So we have to have a communication protocol in place. Our other major challenge for flying at night, well, we're all humans. And sometimes it's not pleasant to be flying in the middle of the night. It's also not pleasant to be flying in the middle of summer either, but it can also be unpleasant to be flying in the middle of the night as well. So crew comfort should always make sure that you are taken into account. An uncomfortable crew member is a distracted one and not a positive to the group. So you must keep in mind, especially it's going to get cold. You might have to fight off mosquitoes, wear suitable clothing for the environment, and all that other fun stuff. I used to do some night flying activities in the San Joaquin Delta area. It was okay for a while, and then the mosquitoes moved in, and that was a terrible, terrible experience. So take it firsthand from me. Make sure that you've got the right clothing and appropriate wear for flying at night, and it's not just thinking about the drone. It's thinking about you as a person and your crew as well. So, what are some of the things that we can do for flying at night to mitigate some of these challenges? This is actually a picture of me and my team doing some testing of our night system. I think this was circa 2013, actually, so about 7 years ago. We were doing our first night flying. So, proper lighting, that's a pretty obvious one. We need to make sure that we have appropriate lighting for our drone. This includes our anti-collision lights to increase the visibility of the drone to other air traffic. Next, we'll also need to make sure that we have navigational lights. Navigational lights to help the pilot in command determine the orientation of the drone. And then we may also want to bring out lots of other additional situational lighting, headlamps, flashlights, because we don't, as humans, want to be tripping and falling over anything else as well. So our anti-collision lights. Anti-collision lights must be attached to our drone and must be visible for at least 3 statute miles away. Now you can use lights that are not nearly as strong, but only if it's in the interest of safety can you use these less bright lights, these dimmer lights. So when might you be able to safely reduce how bright these lights are? What if you don't plan on flying more than 15 or 20 feet away from you? Now, these anti-collision lights can be super bright, migraine-inducing bright, rather. So maybe you don't need to be giving yourself a migraine if you're only going to be flying 10, 15 feet away from you. So that might be one scenario where you might be able to reduce the intensity of these strobe lights. But in general, though, you're going to want to make sure that you've got the brightest lights as possible out there. We found some really good ones. Cree, Firehouse, they make some nice, good ones. Super bright, migraine-inducing lights. At some point, once you purchase them, you should make sure that you can actually see them for 3 miles. I never trust a manufacturer. Always double check. For this one, for testing, find yourself on a nice high point and see if your friend can see it from 3 miles away. It's easy to do if I say, out here in my vernal pool area. Might be a little bit harder to do within suburbs or within a city. Anti-collision lights, in the interest of safety, only applies to human safety. Unfortunately, the FAA is not as considerate of animals as you might hope that they are. When I was doing my night flights in the San Joaquin River area, we were flying drones to count nesting sandhill cranes. That was a fun project, but definitely our bright lights on our drone that we needed for us to see the drone certainly was waking the birds we were flying over. We had to do some modifications to adjust that. Navigational lights. Navigational lights are not the same as our collision lights. Our navigational lights are the lights that help us determine our aircraft orientation during flight. Now, many of our drones already have some sort of navigational lights on them. But what we do find that many of these built-in navigational lights are only useful for maybe 50, 75 feet. As we start to fly our drone farther and farther away, remember, we still must be able to determine the orientation. And if these navigational lights are not bright enough to be seen and to be able to discriminate between the red and the green lights, they are not being useful. So even though our Mavics do have some lights on them, we've got some red lights at the front and green lights on the back legs. Now I can only really see them for maybe 100 feet. So if I want to fly my Mavic farther than that, I will have to attach additional navigational lights on them. Now, most commonly, you'll find red and green, but there are no real standards for navigational lights. It's whatever works best for you. Whether or not they come up with standards, who knows? I'm not anticipating, though, that they would come up with official navigational light standards at any time in the future. Our last set of lights are going to be our situational lights. These are going to be our headlamp, our flashlights, and our headlamps. Now, when we bring these out to the field, make sure that we use the ones with red filters on them. Now, red lights does a much better job of preserving our night vision rather than the full spectrum white or blue lights. So bring out red lights. Everything will not be nearly as bright, but it will not diminish your night vision, and it will help adapt your eyes, prevent taking too long for your eyes to adapt in the dark. Now you may also bring, in addition to headlamps and flashlights, I typically also would bring out red flashlight beacons, little tiny balls of light that we use to help us identify any hazards or any sort of tripping hazards that we may have out in the field. So if I know that I've got, say, a pothole in an area that I might be walking around during flying on, I might actually mark that with a little bit of a red hazard light. So I know that I'm not going to trip and fall into that. Now, planning for our night flying If you're doing your due diligence with our safety planning, that's a good first step, but you really want to take it up another level when it comes to night flying. Safety planning, we really can't assume that our field is going to be safe if all we're doing is just looking at satellite maps. During the day, if we do our pre-flight planning and we print out a satellite map and then we go out to the field, we'll have an opportunity to adjust and see, okay, that tree has grown a couple of inches or they added a new fence line. At night, our ability to notice those changes is significantly diminished. So if possible, bring your entire crew out to your flying site during daylight hours to do your flight site inspection. Make sure you familiarize yourself with the environment and make note of any possible obstructions. And if you can't make it to your site during the daylight hours, make sure that you spend some time looking through your site with flashlights before you start flying. Always, again, consider the worst possible scenario and always have a plan in place for loss of visual contact. What do you do if the lights on your drone suddenly go out? And now we have some additional challenges to overcome. So remember our systematic mission planning. Really make sure you go through a systematic process. This helps you not forget any key steps. Some other operational things to keep in mind. Always plan to keep your drone extra close as you do your flying. During daylight operations, I might fly my drone, 1,000 feet out as I'm doing a larger mapping operation, even with my Phantom 4. But at night, I'm going to scale that back down significantly. I might only do shorter areas, 600 feet, 400 feet, because I know that it's going to be even more difficult to assess threats at night. Some other things that you're going to want to do and update your pre-flight, right? Our pre-flight risk mitigation. Really bump up that pre-flight risk inspection. Make sure that our positioning and anti-collision lights are part of our pre-flight inspection. Really make sure that those things are secure, set in place, and that they have sufficient battery charge. Some of these strobe lights and navigation lights have an additional battery or a supplementary battery that is used to power the lights. They're not attached to the aircraft's main power. They're a separate battery, so make sure that those are properly charged before you go out to the field and check them in flight. Remember, it is going to be a lot harder to do your pre-flight inspections at night, right? Really go through and really check your aircraft for cracks, for leaks, for any sort of issues. Check those props for bumps and dents. Check the motor arms, make sure everything is nice and secure. It's a lot easier to neglect or skip any of these steps at night because we're all cold, somewhat miserable, we're all being attacked by bugs, and we just kind of want to get in and get out. But we can't allow ourselves to fall for that. We really do need to make sure that we take this seriously. Once we get on site, we really do need to make sure that we take the time to validate our mission plan. Did we properly identify all the obstacles that we did? And if you do have to change your flight plan, again, that pre-flight crew briefing is particularly important. Make sure that everyone is aware of any changes you might have had to make to your flight plan because you noticed something new. Just a reminder here about our pre-flight risk mitigation for our crew briefings. Remember, a good crew briefing is not just a 1-2-liner thing. It is a pretty dense, packed piece of information. So remember to make sure that everyone is aware of their roles and responsibilities, any pertinent information that they might need to know for their roles, and what other abnormal conditions to look for. And so here's that pre-flight risk mitigation template again. All sorts of pieces of information that your entire crew should know. And it's even more vitally important at night. Now, weather is going to play a big role in drone operations. We all know that, but it's going to be even a little bit more challenging at night. So during the day, we have a lot of visual cues to help tell us, how windy things might be. We might be able to look around, see the flags, see the leaves, see the trees, see the grass flowing. We don't have any of those visual cues at night. And so we have to be especially cognizant to be looking for ways for us to understand how windy things might actually be. Remember, flying in windy conditions, the windier it is, the harder it is for our drone to fly. Our larger drones may fare better in windier conditions, but nonetheless, if it's windy, our battery use will increase dramatically, and we may need to end our flights earlier than we expect. Always bring out some sort of tool to measure the weather in the field. Bring a handheld wind meter. It's also a good tool to bring out to the field, especially if you're flying at night, because you can't see, our visual cues for the leaves flowing about or the grass waving or tree branches moving about. I had a fun experience flying in the Delta one night. Everything seemed pretty normal as we were driving up to our site, but we didn't take a good look at the weather report before we headed out to the field. Once we got onto the site, everything seemed fine until we actually took off, and then our drone started flying backwards. Our fixed-wing aircraft had a flight cruising speed of around 33 miles an hour, and our drone was more or less flying backwards. That was a pretty worrisome experience, seeing our fixed-wing aircraft flying backwards. But nonetheless, keep that in mind. Always pay extra attention when we fly at night. Now, flying in the cold. This is also something else to keep in mind. For many of us out here in California, we are blessed with good weather throughout the year. I haven't seen snow in quite some time, but I know, so it's always a good reminder of some of the challenges to flying at night, making sure that our crew is obviously comfortable flying at night. Wearing gloves and trying to fly a drone, work that tablet or phone is always a new challenge. Give your winter weather clothes a tryout before you get to the field. You never know what challenges you may have to overcome. Now, also keep in mind that our drone batteries will also need some additional maintenance and care when we're flying at night in very cold weather. Always remember that our LiPo batteries, they have a preferred operating temperature. Keep our batteries warm and not frozen. Keeping our batteries warm, leaving them in the car at a nice room temperature helps. But if you can't keep your batteries warm, make sure that you do spend some time to hover after takeoff to help warm up those batteries a bit before you start doing anything aggressive or flying long distances. Avoid draining our batteries significantly, right? Be prepared to land as soon as that battery reaches 30 or even 40%. Be extra cautious on how we use our batteries. Our batteries will drain slightly faster at night. And then one more thing to keep in mind as we're flying at night, precipitation doesn't just mean rain. We may encounter just humid air flying at night. So always make sure that we're keeping an eye out for that. We're drying off our drone if precipitation or condensation starts to occur on our drone. Remember that our motors and our systems are electronic devices, and they are prone to shorting out. So we'll finish up our short night flying training session talking about visual illusions. Now keep in mind that our eyes do take 30 to 45 minutes to fully adapt to the dark. So once we get on site, don't plan on flying for at least 30 to 45 minutes until we're ready to actually start flying. till our eyes are ready to start flying. But we have some other visual illusions for us to deal with. And we need to make sure that we are cognizant of all of these particular challenges. So just some background on eye physiology. The human eye uses rods and cones for vision. Our rods are what gives us our peripheral and night sensitivity. And our cones are what allow us to see in color. But they lack, effective night sensitivity. So that's why we have poor color perception in the dark. So as we're looking around, we should be utilizing our off-center viewing for looking for dimly lit objects at night, such as our drone. So don't stare at your drone. Instead, look to the left or to the right of your drone and keep that in your peripheral vision. You'll find that to be much more effective. Autokinesis, the visual illusion of fatigue from focusing too hard on one distant object. So it's going to cause you to have some confusion on who is moving. So if we look at a single drone in the sky and maybe that drone is stationary, but we've got some things moving around us, right? It may feel like that drone might actually be moving in an unwanted direction. So make sure that as we are monitoring our drone, we're not staring at our drone. We're keeping our eyes active and engaged by looking around at different objects to avoid fixating on just our single strobe light out there. And as always, it's always best to keep our night flights confined to short bursts. Try to stay in the air only just as long as it takes to complete the mission, and not as long as possible. Right? Keep our eyes from getting too exhausted or fatigued by just doing these shorter flights, short as possible. Another visual illusion that we're going to have to overcome: false depth perception. It is going to be increasingly difficult to gauge distance due to reduced color saturation. Right? Because our cones are the ones that are responsible for color, and we don't have as great a night sensitivity with the cones, our color saturation is reduced. Everything is going to look somewhat dimmed or desaturated, and that prevents us from being able to see and judge accurately the distances of objects and our drone. So remember, take precautions around confined spaces. Lower your personal maximums on how far away you are comfortable flying. So at night, I would say cut your typical flying distance maybe by half or even more. So if I'm typically flying maybe 800 feet, I might not go beyond 400 feet or even 300 feet. Now, if we look at flashing lights too often, we might end up with flicker vertigo. So this is caused by low frequency flickering and bright flashing lights. So there's a imbalance of brain cell activity caused by low frequency flickering. And sometimes it can make us a little sick, a little nauseous, give us a little bit of a migraine. So again, best not to stare at flashing lights for too long. Limit our flights to short bursts. And try to avoid staring directly at these very bright lights. Utilize our scanning techniques and our off-center viewing to make sure that we don't end up with nausea or migraines. Another illusion to deal with: reversible perspective illusion. Incorrectly perceiving something as going away versus towards us, right? So this occurs when an object in motion is incorrectly perceived to be flying away rather than towards the observer. Remember, our light sources are just point light sources, and it is incredibly hard to gauge distance of an object if all we see of it is just a single light source, right? So we just have no ability to gauge distance. And so it might seem like the object is moving away because maybe our eyes got fatigued and now we're dealing with a little bit of empty field myopia or just exhaustion in our eye muscles. And now we might think, uh-oh, it's flying away from us, when actually it's coming towards us, or vice versa. We may also encounter this if we have other moving lights on the ground. remember, we don't have a good frame of reference. All we see are lights out there without the background illumination of the horizon in view. All we see are these lights moving around. Now, if we see one light here and one light there, and this light's moving here, does that mean that this is the static point, or is this the static point, right? It becomes more difficult for us to tell. So how do we combat this? Bring out our visual observers. Make sure that we have visual observers to relay and confirm the flight path of incoming aircraft, of our drone. Make good use of the telemetry screen on our drone to make sure that we have a good understanding of how our drone is moving at night. Size and distance illusion. So a little bit tied in with that perspective illusion. Incorrectly perceiving an object as approaching or retreating due to its luminosity. Again, when we put lights on our drone, our lights are just single point sources. They don't have an inherent size to it. So we might erroneously perceive a bright light as being close and a dim light as being far, but that's not always the case. We cannot judge an object by its luminosity. In fact, when we do our flight operations, one of the things that I would do for judging distance is I judge distance based off how far my two navigational lights are away from each other. So when I had my fixed wing aircraft, I have red lights on one side, green lights on the other side. If they're far apart, that means my drone is close. If they were closer together, that means my drone was farther away. Don't use the light luminosity as a measure of size and distance. So it's a little bit challenging. If we had an opportunity to meet in person, this would have been an opportunity for us to show off some of these visual illusions and give everyone kind of a hands-on opportunity. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to meet in person, but hopefully this training helps you understand some of the challenges that there are when flying at night. So again, most importantly, make sure that we truly account for the challenges in our night visibility. Anti-collision lighting, navigational lighting, making sure that we can even see the environment that we're operating in, headlamps, red lights, hazard lights, anything else that can help us improve our understanding and situational awareness of our environment and our drone. Remember that we also have human factors to keep in mind. Bring out red lights rather than full spectrum lights. Make sure that everyone is closed properly. We've got equipment to deal with mosquitoes and bugs. And that if we're going to be wearing gloves when we're out there flying, that we already know how our gloves can work with our transmitters and our screens, our tablet screens. And then again, always make sure that you're taking proper precautions in our operational planning, really going through that systematically, make sure that you're truly prepared for your night operations. So that's it for our night flying training. If you have, we'll go ahead and answer some questions here, but hopefully this has been helpful for you to understand some of the challenges. And if you are interested in taking our UAS Center of Excellence on UAS Safety Night Flying Certifying Quiz, if you're a member of the UC system and you have a Part 107 license, you may go ahead and take that quiz there. The web slides should have already been posted on the community forum, and you can find those slides and this link there. We also have that tiny URL up there, tinyurl.com/UC-night-flying. So I have plenty of time to answer some questions.